nation. The armed forces basically wind up doing whatever it is the president needs them to do. And I think it's a very narrow view that says they should only be used for fighting major wars. Very often, our interests make it necessary for them to do much more than that, especially in pursuit of these dread activities of nation building, which everybody shudders with horror to think about, but in fact is absolutely necessary in order to convert battlefield success into long-term political success. And the military, since day one, has been involved in quote-unquote nation-building activities, and often very successfully, but that history tends to get overlooked.
Did you read Carl Bilder's book, The Masks of War?
No.
No, he suggests that each of the services, he doesn't deal with the Marines, has its own self-image. For the Air Force, they're boys with toys. For the Navy, it's a senior service, run silent, run deep. For the Army, well, it's whatever anybody else wants you to do, whether you have the stuff to do it with or not. So the ethos may perhaps have to be, to some extent, determined by particularly the forces involved. And of course, in the savage wars of peace, an awful lot of the weight of what was being done was carried by the U.S. Marine Corps.
That's right. And one of the interesting things I found is that although all the services were deeply involved in small war missions, I mean especially the Marines, but also to some extent the Army, you know, their primary job was fighting Indians up until 1890. The Navy was certainly involved in gunboat diplomacy, especially in the Caribbean. But although this was a mainstay of all the services, all of them resisted it because they all wanted the greater glory of big war missions. And although the Army kept fighting Indians, they never came up with the doctrine of Indian fighting. Their doctrine was always geared towards big European land wars. And the Marines were masters of this imperial constabulary duties, and yet they didn't want to do it either. They came up with amphibious warfare between the wars as being their new mission. So the kind of resistance that we see today within the military to these small war missions is a tradition in and of itself. Even though they've always done it, there's always been a resentment of it.
But the Marines actually had a manual which you came upon, and tell us about that manual, a guide for small wars.
Well, this was the Small Wars Manual, which the Marines wrote between the wars based on their experiences in places like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. Basically, a how-to guide for dealing with insurgencies, with guerrillas. How do you run counter-guerrilla warfare? And the Marines did it very successfully. They set down some of these lessons, but then the book, the Small Wars Manual, had the misfortune to be published in 1940. And of course, a year after that, small wars seemed passé. We were certainly in the biggest war in our history. And that was very much the mindset which came to dominate the military post-World War II. And I have a chapter in there on Vietnam in which I basically argue that, unfortunately, a lot of the lessons taught by the Small Wars Manual were neglected by the military in Vietnam. They tried to fight Vietnam as a big war, and I think that was responsible for part of the tragic outcome of our intervention.
Please go ahead.
I was just going to say, couldn't we have learned something from the British experience in Malaya and the French experience, in fact, in French Indochina? It's always amazed me the degree to which both those nations and powers dealt not with complete successes, especially in the case of France. I mean, 1954, Dien Bien Phu, May 1954. It's really in a way the end of it. But both of them did know how to fight these small wars. We don't seem to have learned an awful lot from them.
Yeah, I mean, certainly other countries had a proud tradition of fighting these small wars and using counter-guerrilla tactics, and as I try to show, so did we. We had the same tradition, but unfortunately it gets neglected, and I think part of it was an institutional rivalry in Vietnam because the Marines really had had this institutional knowledge, and they tried to implement it, but the war was not being run by the Marines. It was being run by General William Westmoreland and the Army High Command, and their view was, what is all this nonsense the Marines want to do? We know how to do this war. We're going to put massive firepower down on our targets because that's the way we did it in World War II and Korea. That's the American way of war. And unfortunately, it didn't turn out to be the best way to fight this kind of struggle. And if we had looked a little bit at the history and at the experiences of other people who had fought these kinds of foes, I think we would have come up with a better approach.
Now, your chapter on Vietnam, in a way, is a pivotal chapter, and you just described what the problem was there, but what came out of that was a doctrine called the PAL doctrine. Let's talk a little about that, because in a way, that doctrine and the perception of Vietnam that was associated with that doctrine really influences all that follows up until the present. And in a way, one could say that the 90s were, defined by that doctrine in terms of the way we thought about the military and how we would use it. So remind us now what the Powell doctrine said, and give us an indication of what really was wrong with that.
Well, a whole generation of officers who went through the agony of Vietnam were deeply scarred by it, and understandably so. It was a horrible experience, not only because they lost so many of their brothers on the battlefield, but also because of the institutional damage it did to the military. And they came out of Vietnam saying, never again. We're never going to repeat this kind of fiasco. They didn't come out of it saying, we're going to figure out a better way to fight next time. They just wanted to eschew these kinds of messy, low-level interventions altogether, and that's the essence of the Powell doctrine, saying we're not going to fight these low-level wars ever again. If we ever use force, it's going to be massive, overwhelming. We're going to win instantly and then go home via an exit strategy. That's the essence of the Powell doctrine, and that was, I think, the essence of the post-Vietnam mindset epitomized by General Colin Powell, who was the outstanding officer of that generation. Unfortunately, as we found in the 1990s, that kind of mindset is not a very good fit with the actual missions that the American military is called upon to undertake in places like Somalia or Bosnia or Haiti or Kosovo, places like that, or more recently Afghanistan. You can't just win a massive, overwhelming victory and go home, because if you do, the fruits of victory will crumble before your eyes. So you all have to have a longer-term intervention if you're going to create a stable political order. And we've been doing that since the early days of the Republic, but it's very much outside the ethos of the Powell doctrine. And so what I suggest is that history repudiates a lot of these tenets about how to employ American military force.
And one of the consequences, really, of the Powell doctrine and this perception of what the Vietnam War was about was the notion if you go in, not only do you go in and get out quickly, but you have to have total American support. But more importantly, it was a loss if you lost one American life. So there was a high premium on a war in which no American lives were lost.
That's right. And in the 1990s, the government tried very hard to create these casualty-free interventions. And of course, you don't want casualties. That's a horrible thing. You want to protect your troops as much as possible. But at the same time, if you set up ground rules under which no casualties will occur, it's very hard to achieve the mission that you're sent over there to do. The best way to protect your troops is to keep them in Texas. If you're going to be sending them to places that are inherently dangerous, like the Balkans or Haiti or Afghanistan or whatever, there's going to be a certain amount of risk involved. And I think the men and women who are sent over there understand that risk, and they're willing to take it because they know that's what it takes to accomplish the mission. But if you have these incredibly restrictive force protection guidelines, in effect, it makes it very hard for those troops to achieve the mission. And it actually has a demoralizing effect on the military, because they're being told, well, we're sending you over here, but it's not very important. The job you're doing isn't very important because we don't want you to risk anything in order to achieve success. And that's not the message you want to send to the troops. And certainly soldiers I've talked to don't like those incredibly restrictive guidelines that are in part a product of this Vietnam mindset, which is that we have to avoid casualties at all costs, because if we suffer a single loss, political support will crumble and we won't be able to sustain this deployment.
Can we now? Are we prepared?
I think we are. I think the American people are much more realistic about this than some of the policymakers in Washington. If you look at the survey data, they are much more accepting of casualties and know that you can't have a completely risk-free military intervention. And in fact, if you look at our recent experience in Afghanistan, we didn't suffer huge casualties. It was a couple dozen, but didn't have any perceptible effect one way or the other on the level of public support for the war. I think if the public is convinced that the war is important, they're willing to take risks in order to get the job done. I think part of the problem in the 1990s was that the government had a hard time explaining the importance of some of these missions, and therefore wasn't able to muster support and tried to do them with the least cost possible in order not to have to muster that support. But I think when you're dealing with situations like Afghanistan or Iraq, where people can see a more immediate danger to the United States, I think it's much easier to get public support, even if there are real risks involved.
In looking at the history of these small wars in earlier eras, was public opinion important? And if it was, what really made the difference? Is it that they didn't have pollsters then, or was it that we had leadership, that could bring the issues to the public, and that somehow was aborted in this period after the Vietnam War?
I think the importance of public opinion can be exaggerated, especially when you're dealing with these smaller expeditions involving volunteer soldiers and sailors and Marines. Getting public support is vital if you're going to send draftees, because you're taking young men and women unwillingly from their homes and sending them somewhere to fight. And it's very hard to sustain an unpopular war, as we found out in the later stages of Vietnam, if you don't have full public support. But in many of these smaller wars that I write about in Savage Wars of Peace, there wasn't a huge amount of public support. In fact, there was often quite a bit of opposition, particularly notable in the case of the Philippine War from 1899 to 1902, when a who's who of prominent Americans, from Andrew Carnegie to Mark Twain, mobilized as part of the Anti-Imperialist League against the war. But there was also a substantial amount of public disagreement with deployments in Haiti and Dominican Republic and Nicaragua and Russia, as Professor Barnes mentioned earlier, and so forth. So you can't expect public unanimity. In fact, the only war we've ever had close to unanimity behind was World War II. Every other war has pretty much had some degree of public opposition, but as I try to show in my book, a small number of professional soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines were still able to get the job done, even if they didn't have complete 100% backing at home. So I think it's possible to exaggerate the importance of that public support.
How about collateral damage? How about, in other words, the loss of civilians on the other side specifically?
Well, that's an interesting question, because we've become much more wary of that than we used to be. I mean, it's amazing when you read the accounts of World War II, the firebombing of Japan in 1945, when even before the atomic bombing, when we killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, just incinerated.
Yeah.
And nowadays, if you have one stray bomb that hits a wedding in Afghanistan, this is an international crisis. I think partly this is a result of developing technology, which changes standards and expectations, because in World War II, the bombing technology was very imprecise, and you were lucky if you hit within a few miles of your target. Everybody knew you were going to have massive civilian casualties no matter how hard you tried to avoid it. Now, with the revolution in precision-guided munitions we've seen in the past 20 years, everybody knows that you can pretty well put a bomb very close to its target within a few meters of where you're aiming it at, which creates tremendous expectations that you will always hit only the bad guys, and you will leave the mosque next door perfectly alone.
And the Chinese embassy.
And the Chinese embassy. And generally, I think we do a pretty good job of that. But, this is a very hard activity. You can't be 100% right all the time. You make human errors, you make intelligence errors, all sorts of bombs can go astray no matter how good your technology is. So I think that we have set the bar unreasonably high at this point, but it certainly should be higher than it has been in the past, and I think the American military has become pretty good about collateral damage. This has become much more of an issue than it was 50 years ago.
And you point out that in this era in which the Powell Doctrine held sway, that the concern for the loss of American life was so great that in fact the primary mission became not the mission itself, but actually the protecting of the American troops who were being deployed for the mission.
Right, this crazy ethos where troops who were being sent to Bosnia were told force protection is job one, which made them wonder, well, what the heck are we doing here? Force protection is job one. Why are we being sent to a war zone? That
right.
seems inherently risky.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I hope that we've overcome some of that. It's funny because in places like Bosnia or other war zones, our allies have been much more gung-ho in many ways, including the British and the French, both of whom are much more liable to send their troops to patrol in shirt sleeves and without having a platoon at their back, but just to send a couple of men to wander through a marketplace and do that kind of policing, whereas the American military ethos is we're going to hunker down in Camp Bondsteel or some other fortified facility. We're only going to send troops out, reinforced platoon with armored Humvees and wearing the full battle rattle and all that.
And the Bradley are too.
And the Bradley and all that kind of stuff. And that just makes it very hard to interact with the civilian population. It makes it very hard to do your job, which is to build up trust and to create a stable and secure environment. You're not doing that if you give the impression of being scared yourself.
Before we talk about the consequences of 9/11, which really changed things, you are a part of what we might call a cohort, a younger generation of thinkers and theorists who essentially laid the groundwork in their writings for the present administration to seize the initiative after 9/11. And I would like for you to help us understand what you see as the common themes that emerge from that cohort, and that this cohort was writing about during a very different era, when, during the Clinton era, when in fact we were at the high point